Hello, and welcome to Democratic Dialogue. I'm your host, Rosella Sagal, and I'm here today with Karen Bell. Karen Bell. I'm sorry about that, Karen. We're going to be talking today about her life and her work, which I have been talking with her about and is very interesting. So I'm going to let her work unfold as she answers questions, and I think you're going to be very interested. My first question is, did you grow up in a democratic and a politically active family?
Well, I certainly grew up actually in the Boston area, in Newton and mainly in Wellesley. And my parents were certainly lifelong Democrats, and they had grown up in Minnesota, in small towns where, you know, there had been certainly, I think the Minnesota Democrats are well known for their contributions to American history and our political culture. But so I do remember growing up and remembering my dad, you know, they would talk about stories of the Great Depression and what Roosevelt did. In their view, very positive. And I remember my dad would always be writing long letters to senators and congressmen, which I know, you know, is something of the past, because now we have to write, you know, on the internet or fax letters, and all the letters sent to Congress are now, you know, probably fumigated before they ever arrive. But yes, they were definitely active. Not necessarily, but I wouldn't call them activists. You know, my dad was a university professor when I was growing up, and a scientist, and so that was kind of what we were thinking about, at least, you know, in the home.
Yeah. Wow. So you definitely grew up with democratic ideals, though. That
Yes.
was part of your life.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. One of the stories that really struck me when we were talking about things you had done was that when you and your husband were in Chile, that was during the time of the overthrow of Allende, and I would really like you to talk some about that.
Okay. Well, I got married as I was, well, pretty much when I finished college, and so we were both very interested in Latin America, and my husband, Peter, was working with the Ford Foundation at the time, and we went to Chile so that he could be in charge of the Chile office of the Ford Foundation in Santiago. And we went there just after Salvador Allende was elected president, and he was the head of a coalition, really, of parties. You know, some of whom didn't play well together necessarily, but nevertheless, he was the democratically elected president. And we were there for close to about 3.5 years, including, you know, all of the period of his presidency, and then when the military coup took over power, we were there, and that was quite scary, dramatic, and after the coup, I mean, we didn't feel as though we were in imminent danger, personally, although we knew that we were probably under surveillance. And this was a time in our history, actually, this brings in the role of the United States, unfortunately, because I think the leaders in the U.S. government at the time felt very threatened by developments in Chile. And of course, this was the era of the Cold War. We were still in the Cold War, and they felt, you know, Chile posed a threat to the rest of Latin America. I don't think they really understood Chilean politics. There were about 17 active parties in Chile. And so you had to be very adept at talking to anybody, because within a few sentences you could pretty much tell what political persuasion, you know, they held, which party they were likely affiliated with.
Really? Just that quickly?
Just very quickly. Chileans, have an incredible political culture, but the coup changed all of that, and there were many people in danger, many intellectuals and academics and administrators from the former government who were being persecuted. Some were actually killed and jailed, and so the Ford Foundation then changed from being an organization dedicated to improving post-secondary and graduate education to one that was really dedicated to human rights and saving the lives and the careers of the people some of the leaders who were being persecuted. So they were very, I think, effective in doing that. And then when we returned to the United States, this would have been, this was then in 1974. I know my husband continued to be very active in fighting for human rights in Chile, and in fact, the Democratic Party in Massachusetts, or at least two leading Democrats, were very, very influential in this whole movement, really, to almost create, to put human rights as a legitimate area for U.S. foreign policy. And Senator Ted Kennedy and our Congressman Michael Harrington at the time, I think, were both incredibly helpful in saying that that they wanted the United States Embassy in Chile to pay attention to human rights, which was really a first, and I think that started a whole movement. So that was a very interesting time in our history.
To be on the front lines of something so...
and that's when I began my own career in public health. I had actually attended the University of Chile as a student and got a degree in public health.
That's where you got your degree in public health?
Was the first degree in health education, yes.
Wow, that must be amazing. So you actually took your degree in Spanish?
Yes. Yes. Wow. Yeah, I was the only American student, and it was a UN-sponsored program.
Wow.
So that was very interesting.
That must have been a time. That's terrific. I can't imagine what that must have been like with all that going on. I'd like to hear more about that, but I suppose we should move on. You also mentioned that you went in New York City, then you were working with a center that was addressing issues of children in poverty.
That was later in my career. I had, by that time, we had actually lived in Washington for a while, and I had gotten a master's of public health at Columbia and worked in international health, or global health as it's called today, at the National Academy of Sciences. But then when we moved to New York again, I worked it was called the National Center for Children in Poverty at Columbia University. And the goal was to put the needs of young children growing up in poverty, which at that time I think were about 20 to 25% of all young children under the age of 6 in the country, and put their needs sort of front and center, as a political, or at least put them on the political map as a group that deserves just as much attention as the elderly. And of course, as we all know, Social Security and Medicare had, largely at least alleviated, I think, the worst of the poverty among seniors. But no similar programs had really been enacted for younger children. So,
in that time.
Right, and so I think the goals were to expand quality early childhood programs like Head Start. And of course, here in Gloucester, I think the Pathways for Children is that program. Family support programs, and of course, healthcare. And now I think we've actually achieved quite a bit since then.
That's true. As you talk, I've forgotten that there was a time when we didn't have those.
That's right. So, or at least this was the time. I think the Medicaid expansions had just taken place, but many states hadn't really taken full advantage.
Yeah.
And now I think Massachusetts is actually a leader in the movement to expand health care coverage, at least, well, for most groups. So it certainly, I think we've come a long way, but there's still a huge amount to do.
And certainly globally.
Right, definitely.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. As you talk, I can see where those democratic ideals certainly have.
One experience that I had at the National Center was we had done a study of good programs that provided health care and comprehensive services to young children, and had found maybe 20 different programs around the country, and had little case summaries written up and lessons learned, and that, I think, from that publication and with the help of an advisory group, we actually made a formal set of recommendations to Hillary Clinton as she was putting together her health care reform team. And of course that was a very interesting lesson. I think we were so excited about the findings, about what makes for good programs and good policies. And then, to have the insurance industry basically, come together and put on this incredible campaign to destroy, really to discredit everything that the Democrats were trying to do in the minds of the general public or of Congress. I'm still not sure exactly what happened, but I think everybody took away some very sobering lessons at that point.
Yeah, still happening.
And so, of course, now I think the issues have changed a little bit, but it's still about cost and access and quality, and I think we still have a lot more to do. But I think the Democrats, I feel that at least they have the right goals in mind, and we can all debate about what the exact strategies should be, but I think there are many paths to getting there. To improving healthcare quality and access for everyone.
Certainly the Democrats are the people who at least want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, improve it.
That's right.
But at least open the door.
I think so. I feel that the Democrats are reasonable. Their one fault might be that they see issues. We see issues as complex. It's not simple. It's not, when you're talking about reducing drug abuse, for example, it's not just say no. It's maybe 5 or 6 things that are worth doing. Similarly, I think healthcare, it is complex. You don't just expand access for everybody without addressing some other things. And so, I certainly think we're willing to work with people who don't hold exactly the same views.
Well, you must find the same frustration of all of us do if we can't even talk about it. Because the specter of some kind of socialism blocks all discussion is so frustrating. We can't even look at other countries or how they do it. There was an interesting front line called Sick Around the World, where they looked at just the basics of many countries, very basically. And I was like, we have so little dialogue about how it could possibly look.
Yes, well, I think that's where many people just forget we do live in a global society. There are many, many lessons from other countries, good and bad.
Right, exactly.
And I think, we don't want a system that looks like, some other countries, but there are many, many good things. Exactly.
Well, when you talked about global health, that was something I wanted to ask you about, is we somehow seem to live in a bubble.
Yeah. Well, and then what I think we forget, there are interventions, of course, that certainly affect everybody, that are good interventions that don't cost very much. and they do improve. You know, I mean, the case, for example, which is something I worked on when we lived in Atlanta, most up until about 3 years ago. And I was working at Emory University. Folic acid was a big success story because scientists discovered that it was very effective in preventing birth defects, especially a very serious one called spina bifida. And by adding a little bit of folic acid to the flour, the enriched flour in the United States, it was possible to at least cut this defect by certainly more than half in the United States. And this has been achieved with the cooperation of industry. And, you know, the FDA was instrumental in doing this, but it took a lot of persuasion and listening to the evidence.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this was enacted during 1992, which I think was a Democratic. This was.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think that was Democratic government, but
Yeah.
it's not. It's really a bipartisan issue. But
Yeah.
certainly,
Yeah.
I think Democrats are willing to listen to scientific evidence, which.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Those kinds of interventions are so important. Yeah. Yeah. That is I realized when you mentioned that before, that was fascinating because I assumed it had been there much longer.
Oh, no. No, actually, though, we've been adding things to the flour for some years, to restore some of the nutrients that milling takes out.
That's
exactly,
that's
thiamine and some other, yes.
Okay, that explains it.
Exactly. And I mean, similarly, many communities add fluoride to the water.
But some people are
and some
complaining
don't.
About that, and it's a shame.
Well, I think like as with any intervention, you have to look at the risks and the benefits. And similarly, I think with vaccines. But those are, sort of classic public health stories. I mean, clean water, for example.
Right.
I think regulation, which is something I know Democrats have championed.
Yeah.
We do need clean water. And there are risks and benefits. You don't necessarily achieve perfection, but you have to weigh both sides equally. But I think that was, as we were talking yesterday, one of the things I think Democrats do champion is they promote science in the public interest and listening to the evidence, and whether it's, global warming, for example, which definitely will affect us locally.
Right, exactly.
Or stem cell research. I mean, I think that, or evolution.
Right.
Democrats are willing to look at the evidence, by and large, and say, well, if we're kind of impartial, but at least we don't close off a whole body of knowledge just because it doesn't correspond to somebody's beliefs.
That's true, and it's very important that. I was thinking when you were talking about clean water, and that's for everyone. Mm-hmm. And fluoride in the water, that's for everyone. Whereas if you don't put it in the water, then some people get it who go to the dentist or have extra fluoride treatments.
Well,
so it feels very democratic to me because it's fluoride for everyone who has water.
Right.
But I think some people might consider that big government because you have to regulate it.
Well, that's true. And I mean, I actually, when I grew up, I mean, my dad brought home fluoride drops. The minute he knew that it was effective, he brought them home and said, we have to take the fluoride drops to prevent cavities. And so I benefited the least, and my younger brother, who was 6 years younger, benefited the most. And he never got a cavity. But
my husband.
But not everyone would know. In other words, that's the kind of a case where only people who know that there is an intervention and know how to get it
Right.
can
Right.
benefit.
Right.
But that's why, an approach that will benefit everyone, I
Right.
think, is so much more equitable.
Yeah.
Which
is
again, where I think the Democrats
right.
at least in my mind, they stand for a more just and equitable
Right.
society.
Right. But some people, but the other party can see that as big government, depending on how you look at it. It can be turned around
Well,
and said, because if you have good health care for all, that can grow the government, because you have to have a body to distribute the health
Well,
care.
I think the size of the government is it's all relative, and I've certainly traveled enough and lived abroad, at different times, and I've seen what happens in countries where people don't trust the government.
Right.
They don't want to pay taxes.
Yeah.
In fact, it's our income tax system and that of other industrialized countries doesn't operate in the developing world to the same extent. And so what is the result? You have a country where in some places people have to hire their own security guards if they're wealthy enough, and they don't have waste collection. They hire private groups to dispose of their waste, their garbage. They don't necessarily pay income taxes, and they live in walled compounds if they have enough money. And then the disparities in income is between the wealthiest and the poorest is probably 1,000-fold. And in the United States, I think the gulf between the very poorest and the wealthiest is certainly growing.
It's headed that direction.
So this is a trend. So I think we have to, think about what kind of a world do we want, what kind of a country do we want, and a local community. And I think here in Gloucester we're very lucky. I don't think you see those huge extremes. And I think we have a community where people are certainly working together on issues that many people care about, education, and I think even all the issues that we care about, we have to think about working locally, nationally, and at the state level, and even globally.
Yes. Yes.
Depending on what it is.
We're kind of, we have to. We can't avoid that. I agree with you about, I agree with you exactly when I read about these gaps, and that's the kind of world I wonder, what is the world view that you want? If we allow this huge income gap, what kind of world is that? Do we really want that? I think most of us do not. People who like living in Gloucester probably don't want that kind of world, or we wouldn't be living here.
That's right. I think
most of us enjoy Gloucester because it is a town with all kinds of levels. We all live together, and we wouldn't be living here, really. I enjoy Gloucester because it's a town.
Right. Well, and I think in Gloucester, people are aware of what's going on. I mean, they're aware of what their neighbor is doing. They won't let their neighbor get away with anything that's not quite within the codes and approved. And I think that we forget sometimes, if there's this much activity and interest at the very local level, that's government working at its best. That's citizens engaging. And I think, we can see the results. They're not necessarily perfect. There aren't necessarily enough resources, but at least I think people are trying and they're engaged. And I don't think the same thing necessarily happens in every community or, in other states or around the country. So that, there's just huge differences.
Yeah.
And there's some groups who literally lack the resources or the education, or they feel disconnected. And we can see the results. I mean, we don't have the same level of dialogue or interest in other places.
That is true. Sometimes we have too much dialogue here.
Well,
but I don't know that you can, really. Really. I had a question here, which you've been answering all along. Do you think being a Democrat has influenced your choices? And it certainly has, from everything you've said.
Well, I think it probably has. I'm not sure. I mean, the people who work in public health, I think, are very much conscious of, what happens to the greater society, the people in greatest need. And I think that's part of the choice you make when you want to work in this career. I mean, it's not especially lucrative, or, but I think there are some wonderful lessons, from the world of public health about what, how government intervention can work at its best, and also measuring results. And I think that's one of the things that I believe in strongly. I mean, if you can measure what happens, you've achieved a success. And I think sometimes, and that carries over, into any part of the society that we're trying to change. For example, education. You can certainly measure results and see, is what you're trying to do, is it working? And make corrections. But I think that's certainly one of the things I care about locally. And
well, that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing, I think.
Certainly. Or voting. If you're trying to get out the vote, we know how many people vote and in which precincts. So I think that, again, we have a very direct measure of our efforts.
That's true. Well, you can think of it like as an epidemiologist, you think, in
that's right.
in the big numbers and the big pictures, which is an interesting way to look at things, certainly. That's well, we have a lot of challenges locally.
Yeah, many more challenges locally, but I think it's certainly fun to try here in Gloucester. And I'm proud to be a Democrat.
Yes. Well, we have to start wrapping things up here. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've only touched on many of the interesting things you've done. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I'm sure everyone's enjoyed hearing what you had to say. And I'd like to thank the audience and hope you have enjoyed listening to us, and say goodbye.
Great.